Week 7 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. What a season it's been for St. Brown once again. Last week it was a down game for him, but he still went out there, had 16 fantasy points in PPR week. So this week in a potential high-scoring game with Tampa Bay coming to town, and their defense can't stop anyone. I think St. Brown has a field day in this one. Number 2, Jaxon Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. So JSN quickly moving up the ranking boards the first month and change of the fantasy football season, and he's going out there making big plays. I know Derek Stingley might be on him in this game. He's one of the better corners in the league, but him and Sam Darnold are locked in, and JSN, it doesn't matter the matchup. He's going out there and putting up elite numbers weekly. Number 3, Jamar Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So last week, Chase had a big ball game, 10 catches, over 90 yards, found the end zone. Him and Joe Flacco missed on a couple plays, but obviously that's figured to happen, where Joe Flacco only practiced a few days with the Cincinnati Bengals. So obviously he's an upgrade over Jake Browning in the lineup. This week it's a matchup versus the Steelers, a team that Joe Flacco's familiar with going back to his Raven days, playing with the Browns a little bit in the division. I think Chase, if it's Ramsey or Slay on him in this ball game, still could go out there and put up elite numbers. Number 4, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. Right now, it looks like J.J. McCarthy's going to be back in the starting lineup, and obviously I think it takes a hit on everybody in this lineup for this Minnesota Viking team. And this week, it's not a great matchup versus Philadelphia. We know they got a good secondary with Cooper DeJean and Mitchell back there in the secondary, but even though Mitchell's banged up with a hamstring, we don't know if he's going to play. But Justin Jefferson, we've seen him go out there with not great quarterbacks and still put up numbers. So this week, I think Jefferson still goes out there and has a good game. Number 5, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. Last week, he had that big breakout game a lot of fantasy owners were waiting for. London, over 150 yards, found the end zone in the upset victory on Monday Night Football versus the Buffalo Bills. And this week, it's a matchup at San Francisco. Banged up defense, obviously. Fred Warner out for the season, got hurt last season. Bosa's been out a while now, and he's going to be out for the season. And their secondary just isn't that good. Backups in Tampa Bay's receiving room. 4th and 5th wide receivers will burn in that secondary and making plays. I think London goes out there once again. I'd expect a nice game from him. Number 6, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. Looks like Lamb is going to try to practice here today, Wednesday. First day of practice opening up, obviously, for all teams going into Sunday. And CeeDee Lamb, he's had a nice break where George Pickens filled in that number 1 receiving role, and he had some monster ball games. If Lamb could get it going after the high ankle sprain, he's been out since week 3 versus Chicago Bears. I think this 3-4 week rest is going to help Lamb, and this week in a matchup versus the Commanders, a game that's big for both teams here within the division. I think Lamb comes back and expect him to put up his type of numbers that he's done throughout his career. Number 7, Davante Adams of the Los Angeles Rams. So now Puka Nacua, he's going to be out in this game with the foot injury. Most likely Puka, I think week 9, he'll come back after the bye in week 8, and now Adams will operate as the number 1 wide receiver in London versus Jacksonville Jaguars. Adams, he's had a couple good games this season and then a couple games where it was flat, but now he'll be the number 1 target in this offense, and this Jacksonville secondary just isn't that good. So Adams this week could be one of the better weeks of the year we see from him. Number 8, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. I know last week he didn't do anything with Deebo, failed to reach double-digit fantasy points in the loss versus Chicago Bears, but this week it's a slam dunk matchup with the Dallas Cowboys, a secondary that can't stop anyone. Terry McLaurin, good chance he returns to the lineup as well. That opens things up a little bit more for Deebo. And Deebo, throughout his career, he has a great track record versus Cowboy team. Number 9, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Nico Collins, he's been steady once again. Obviously the number 1 option in the passing game for this Houston Texan team. Not much going on in that receiving room. Higgins, Christian Kirk, Xavier Hutchinson got Schultz at tight end. But this week at Seattle, where they know they got to put points on the board versus high-powered offense, I think Nico Collins, he gets peppered with targets in this one. Number 10, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. So like I said early in the video, he's been filling in as the number 1 wide receiver the last month of the season for CeeDee Lamb. And he's gone out there and he's had some monster ball games already. 6 touchdowns for Pickens on the season in 6 ball games. And last week he went over 150 yards, found the end zone in that ball game at the New York Jets. And this week in a potential high-scoring game versus the Commanders, even with Lamb most likely back in the lineup, I still think Pickens is a top 10 receiving option. Number 11, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. Odunze, he had an off kick at the Commanders in the Week 6 victory. But Rome Odunze, Caleb Williams, they've been locked in since the last season when they both came into the league as rookies. And this week in a great matchup versus the Saints, I think Odunze bounces back in this one. Number 12, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So this Chief team 3-3 without Rice. Now he's back here Week 7. It's going to take a little bit, I think, for him to get his legs under him as Rashee Rice. But it's a good way to get him back in and get things going for Rice with a good matchup versus the Vegas Raiders that obviously can't stop anyone. And Patrick Mahomes, he's playing at that MVP level once again this season. After the last 2 seasons, he didn't do much this week with a good matchup versus Vegas. And Rice, he did play in the preseason at least. He's totally not out of the loop 100%. I'm sure he's trying to stay in shape as well. So this week, it's a good matchup, like I said, for him to get his feet wet and back on track. 13, Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. Sutton last week, it was a bad game for him. But this week, I think it's a bounce back. Denver back home. New York Giants coming in. And this Bronco team, I said it in other videos this week, they just went in flat versus the New York Jets after coming off a big victory at the defending champ Philadelphia Eagles. So Courtland Sutton, we've seen this season as well. He would have a bad game and then he would go out there the next week and score 100 and a touchdown. So this week we'll see if that pattern could continue for him. Number 14, DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. DK Metcalf, it's been a solid first year for him in Pittsburgh in the first 6 weeks of his career with this Steelers team. Him and Aaron Rodgers are locked in, and I've said this a lot as well. Rodgers, doesn't matter who his number 1 wide receiver is. Just throughout his career, we've seen big production from his number 1 wideout in terms of putting up numbers and fantasy points. And this week, another good matchup at a bad Cincinnati Bengal defense. Number 15, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. Ever since taking over the number 1 wide receiver role with Tyreek Hill out for the season, and he's been out since Week 4 now with the knee injury. And Waddle, he's gone out there and he's making plays. He's finding the end zone. And now he's living up to the potential of that contract that he got a couple seasons ago. But this week, it is a tough matchup at Cleveland. Their bend but don't break defense has one of the better corners in the league as well in Denzel Ward. But I think Jalen Waddle, which is pretty much him and Darren Waller in the passing game, is going to work into volume in this one. 16, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Beat Tom last week. He had a nice ball game, 90 yards, found the end zone. Still, drops have been a problem for him, and he's scared to cross the middle of the field as well. Looks like it's been a problem for Thomas Jr. But this week versus the Rams in a potential high-scoring game in London, where obviously Jacksonville's played there many seasons in a row, at least one game, and they've been putting points up over there as well in London. I think Thomas Jr. has another solid performance. 17, Tatora McMillan of the Carolina Panthers. Last week was his breakout game. I know it was the Dallas Cowboys. They can't stop anyone. But McMillan, number 1 receiver coming out this season of college. He can run all the routes. He's got the height. He's got the speed. And like I said, last week he scored 2 touchdowns versus Dallas. And this week at a bad Jet secondary, it wouldn't be surprising to me if he scores another one. Number 18, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So there's some optimism. He's going to practice today and play in this week's ball game at Detroit. And obviously they need him. Chris Godwin, he's not going to play this week. Mecca Ibuka, he's out with the hamstring injury. We'll see how long that is going to be for Ibuka, and he's out as well in this game. So now it's down to Cameron Johnson, Sterling Shepard, and Tez Johnson if Mike Evans can't go. But like I said, timetable for Evans' hamstring injury was 2-3 weeks. He's at that point now. Last week he did some side work in practice, and I think this week with that extra day rest, and they need him out there, he's going to play at the Lions. 19, Ladd McConkey. Donkey last week, big ball game, 42-yard catch, put him in field goal range, and Cameron Dicker put the game away with the field goal, and 100 yards, found the end zone. Now 2 weeks in a row, McConkey's found the end zone, so I think he had to adjust a little bit with Keenan Allen back in the fold with this Charger team, where last season, obviously, he was with the Bears. Now McConkey and Justin Herbert back on the same page, and this week in a potential high-scoring game versus the Colts, I think McConkey goes out there and has a productive ball game. 20, Stephon Diggs of the New England Patriots. So Stephon Diggs last week, he put in a bad ball game after 2 games in a row, over 100 yards receiving. I think in that Week 5 game, after he put everything into it, it was like the Super Bowl to him at the Buffalo Bills. He obviously had a disappointment game, and he was most likely gassed after that Bill game. And also remember, he's a guy who came back very quickly from a torn ACL where he tore it last season, Week 8, Week 9 range. and he was ready all the training camp and week 1 of the regular season. So like I said, Stephon Diggs might have took him a little bit of recovery after he put everything into that game in Buffalo. But this week at Tennessee, after he put in a stinker last week versus Saints, and it was a Kayshon Boutte show, I think he bounces back with a good ball game. 21, Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers. Last week he didn't play as Quentin Johnston. Chargers pulled the game out at the end with a game-winning field goal with Dicker and Ladd McConkey. Obviously, he had a nice ball game, but Quentin Johnston, it's been a breakout year 3 season for him. This week, a good matchup versus Indianapolis, which should be a high-scoring game. And him and Justin Herbert have been locked in all season long. 22, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. So last week, some encouraging signs in terms of fantasy football with A.J. Brown. He had 14 PPR fantasy points. This week, tough matchup in Minnesota. Good defense, obviously. But this offense, something's got to give, and I think they're due for a breakout, especially last week getting embarrassed from the last place New York Giants on Thursday Night Football. So A.J. Brown, I know the body language isn't good. I know he most likely wants out of Philadelphia. It looks like the way he's just talking to the media and not worrying on the field as much. But this week in Minnesota, in a game that Philadelphia has to bounce back, I think he shows up and puts in a decent performance. 23, Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts. Last week, only 4 points in PPR leagues, but I think Michael Pittman will bounce back. This week, it is a little bit of a tough matchup versus a good secondary of the Chargers, but also this Indianapolis Colts team, they've been matchup-proof this season. They're putting points on the board. Daniel Jones has really turned this franchise around in one season, beating out Anthony Richardson, obviously in training camp and preseason, and now all these guys are going out there and producing for the most part. 24, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. So Chris Olave, we could see a trade come down the pike sooner than later before the NFL trade deadline in the next few weeks. And Olave, he is getting peppered with targets. New Orleans, they're always chasing points. And this week at the Bears, I believe they'll be chasing points once again at Soldier Field. And Olave, as long as he's healthy, he's been a productive wide receiver throughout his career. 25, Kendrick Bourne of the San Francisco 49ers. So I don't know if Ricky Pierce is going to play. Jawan Jennings, I doubt he plays. He has 5 fractured ribs, high ankle sprain, and a shoulder injury. And Kendrick Bourne's been going out there and putting up big numbers 2 weeks in a row with 142 yards in each game. Kendrick Bourne. So this week a matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. The defense last week went out there, shut down for the most part Buffalo's passing game. But I think Atlanta this week is beatable, and Kendrick Bourne, even if George Kittle's back in the lineup as well, I still think he could go out there and be a fringe 2-3 option for fantasy owners. 26, Keenan Allen of Los Angeles Chargers. So Keenan Allen, his numbers have definitely taken a hit over the last few weeks, where the first 3 weeks of the season it was 17 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. But when there's a lot of mouths to feed offensively, Ladd McConkey, Quentin Johnston, even though he missed last week's game, obviously the tight end Ron Gatson had a couple decent games this season as well. Just Keenan Allen's fallen off just a little bit. He's still a veteran that can help, obviously, fantasy owners, help this Charger team. But like I said, the last couple weeks, his numbers have dropped off. 27, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So this week a matchup versus Philadelphia, good secondary, even though we saw the New York Giants last week and Jackson Dart pick apart that secondary with some big throws and big plays. But the thing is, if J.J. McCarthy's in there quarterback, which it looks like it's most likely with Carson Wentz banged up with the shoulder injury, and we don't know if he's going to play this week, everyone on this offense is going to take a hit in terms of fantasy football. 28, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Last week he left the game with a concussion. Jacoby Brissett still went out there, put up numbers, kept his team in the game. It looks like Kyler Murray's going to be out once again with that foot injury. But the thing with Marvin Harrison, last season, a lot of high expectations for him after a monster college career at Ohio State. And then this season, up and down, inconsistency. So this week, if he does play with the concussion and gets out of the protocol, very tough matchup versus the Green Bay Packers. 29, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Worthy, a lot of injuries this season, shoulder injury early in the year, tweaking the ankle a little bit as well, week 5, week 6, but he played through it, even though the numbers haven't been great. And now, obviously, with Rashee Rice back in the lineup, pretty much he's the third option in this offense is Worthy, and even fourth at times with Hollywood Brown, who had 2 touchdowns last week. But this week in the matchup versus the Raiders, it just takes one deep ball for him to have a day. 30, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So they have hopes he finally comes back this week, even though we've been hearing that over the last 2 weeks here for Terry McLaurin. So it's been a total lost season so far for Scary Terry. And I've said it in other videos, when these guys miss training camp, they either get injured or underperform. And McLaurin now has been out for a while, but this week at Dallas will be a good return game for him. This Cowboy defense can't stop anyone. He's got a great career track record as well at the Cowboys. And also, this is a must-win ball game for both these teams if they want to keep their playoff hopes alive, even though I know it's only week 7 of the season. 31, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. T. Higgins, he's been an up-and-down wide receiver so far this season. And this offense obviously took a monster hit in production when Joe Burrow went out for the season. But last week, Jamar Chase put up his numbers. He's the only guy week in and week out I trust on this offense in my starting lineup. But T. Higgins, at least the last 2 weeks in a row, 11.2 fantasy points. So that's a start for him. This week, it's a matchup versus Steelers. A good defense, obviously. One of the better secondaries in the league. But still, Higgins, one of the better number 2 wide receivers in the league. And I think this week, maybe he could have another double-digit game. 32, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So weekly, him and A.J. Brown, their stocks are just dropping quickly down the rankings in fantasy football. So Devonta Smith, he's been a deep ball threat or nothing the first part of his career. Then the last couple of years, he was starting to run routes more, make plays. But this season, Dallas Goedert's been the number 1 option in this passing game, and it's not even close with Devonta Smith and A.J. Brown. So I know Smith, he's had 2 good games out of 6 this season, but pretty much at this point and with a tougher matchup in Minnesota, he's been a boom or bust receiver. 33, Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. This week, a good matchup at the Arizona Cardinals. Last week, I thought Green Bay, they didn't throw the football much, and rightfully so, they didn't have to. Josh Jacobs, he ran wild in that ball game versus Cincinnati Bengals. And this week, this could be another Jacobs type of game in Arizona. Their run defense isn't that great. Just saw Jonathan Taylor go out there, have a big game. And Dobbs, he's number 1 wide receiver right now in this offense. I think 10, 11 fantasy points is the range for Romeo Doubs weekly. 34, Trey Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders. In my opinion, he's the number 1 wide receiver in this Raider offense. Looks like Brock Bowers not going to play once again this week. They'll rest him through the bye in week 8, and hopefully in week 9 he's back. But Trey Tucker and Geno Smith have good rapport. We saw him have that breakout game early in the season at the Commanders, 145 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns. In the last couple weeks, he's scoring anywhere from 10, 12 fantasy points. So as a flex option, or if you're in deeper leagues where you play more players with more flexes, or like his 14, 16 team league, I think Tucker's a good option. And this week at Kansas City, once again, they'll be chasing points. 35, Matthew Golden of the Green Bay Packers. Matthew Golden, as the weeks go on, the playing time's going up. I know Jaden Reed's still out with the shoulder injury. Possibly Christian Watson's going to return to the lineup, but you can't count on him where he's been injured throughout his NFL career. And Matthew Golden was a first-round pick, and he's going to see the field, and him and Love are starting to build rapport and get things going. And this week, it's a good matchup at Arizona. And the 36th and final wide receiver I'm ranking is Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions. I have to see more out of Williams. I've said this in another video. 4th or 5th option in this offense behind Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporte, and then your 2 running backs in Jahmyr Gibbs and Montgomery out of the backfield. But this week versus Tampa Bay, back home is Detroit, it wouldn't be surprising to me Jameson Williams catch a deep ball. But like I said, last week was a start for him. 6 catches, 66 yards, and found the end zone. But like I said, you have to see another good week from Williams for me to move him up the rankings. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 7 of the fantasy football season.